'83 then was another seismic year for Social Security because of the changes made in the so-called Greenspan Commission. And you write about that in issue brief number 3. And the thing that really stands out at that, to me anyway, is that perhaps you could say they overcorrected for the adjustments, the shortfall that they had, and produced this enormous surplus. And that was, you say, unanticipated.
Yeah. So, you basically had two issues. You had the program, because of stagflation, it was paying large cost of living adjustments, but wages weren't growing fast enough to pay for them. And so you had this temporary shortfall between this, the late 70s and the early 80s. But because they had already legislated this big tax increase that would take effect in 1990, had they taken some small measures at that point, they could have, sort of gotten through the temporary shortfall, and the program would have gotten back on track in 1990 when the tax increase took effect. But the one thing that they did in addition to that is when they looked at the program over a 75-year period, they said, well, we've got these near-term shortfalls, and we're going to take care of that with some changes. They, for example, delayed the cost of living adjustment. They started taxing benefits. So they made some short-term changes that boosted the surplus, plus the payroll tax increase took effect. But when they looked out in the long run, they still had these big deficits. And the one thing that Congress did is they said, well, we're going to raise the retirement age. And so at the time, the retirement age, the normal retirement age was 65. And so they voted in 1983 to raise the retirement age. But because the demographic problem didn't really affect the program until the early 2000s, they delayed the increase in the retirement age. So the retirement age actually just this year has finally finished going up to age 67 for people who turn 62. So simply they voted in 1982 to raise the retirement age, 20 years or 40 years in the future. So it was obviously gave people plenty of notice. But of course, what that did in terms of the short-term surpluses and slightly reducing the long-term deficits, but not eliminating the deficits in the long term, they created this phenomenon where the trust fund was projected to build up to some enormous, originally the estimates were, $12 trillion in trust fund balance. And then of course it would be depleted so that by the time you got to the 2050s or roughly 2060, that trust fund would all go away. Now, of course, since then, there have been changes in the economy and changes in demographics, and that trust fund exhaustion date has moved forward. And so now here we are in 2023, looking at a date somewhere around the 2030s. So we're now, about 10 years out from trust fund exhaustion.